So we got it crossed. He thought it was last weekend. He was going to be gone. It was this weekend. So we had to switch out, and that's okay as well. So please remember the Bensons who are on the road. I wanted to say something to Troy before we get. Troy, I sent you some photos. That's for morning worship. So, okay. Okay, let's go to Acts 27. I'd like you to turn there with me. When I realized I was going to have Sunday school, I began to think, well, what am I going to do for a one-shot message in Sunday school? So I began to reflect, and I decided that we'll do something that probably most of you here have heard me preach through Acts 27 before, but I'm not going to deal with it like I did before. This is going to be a little different, and we're going to go through it, but my comments are going to be on a different strain than just trying to get the details of this journey of Paul from Caesarea to Rome. We're going to go through the journey, but we're going to take it a little differently than we've ever done it before. I enjoyed thinking about this and preparing for it, and I trust you'll be blessed as we do. I'm assuming familiarity with this section because I've taught it here more than once, and I know that you've read it several times. And this is the famous trip that the Apostle Paul and Dr. Luke and Aristarchus and who knows who else were on to go to Rome. And it's extremely geographically correct. And Luke was obviously taking travel notes, and he knew everything about what happened and when it happened and where it happened. And you can follow this trip on a map in your Bible. Most Bibles have a study map that you can follow the trip on and as they move through. And it's certainly worthy of investigation. And Luke is so accurate on this trip that it is a testimony to his accuracy in everything else he recorded. So it's a value in many ways. And of course, there was a great storm, and that was what interrupted the whole thing. And Paul and everybody on board were in incredible danger. And you and I live in times of storm. And I think if Jesus tarries, we're going to have a storm of our own to sail through. Economic storm, political storms, military storms. We can't help but sense that. Many have said we're nearer World War III than we've been since World War II. And when you think of China and North Korea and Iran, and you think of the economies of those countries and the economy of our own country, then you think the military problems in the Middle East and Ukraine, economically and militarily and providentially, it certainly looks like the storm clouds are rising. It's very easy to get nervous. It's very easy to be disquieted. And especially when we see corruption in our government, corruption in our society, and even judicially as well as politically and economically. the ship of state is in very probable, definitely possible, but maybe even probable stormy weather. Very stormy weather, probably more than we've ever seen. When we look at Acts 27, very similar. The Jewish war with Rome was imminent. It hadn't happened yet. This is probably 59, 60 AD, but the storm clouds were rising. That war ended in 70 with the destruction of Jerusalem. And the military storm descended on the Holy Land, which had become the unholy land with their rejection of their Messiah. The Jewish temple leadership was totally corrupt and ruthless. They were ruthless. In 62 AD, James, the brother of Jesus, was killed. That's just a couple of years after this event. In 40 AD, even earlier, James, the brother of John, was beheaded. So believers were losing their lives, and the church was under a storm of turbulence, persecution. The court system was corrupt. Does that sound familiar? When we read in the book of Acts, in the chapters preceding this, the court system was so corrupt, you could not get a fair trial. Paul couldn't get a fair trial under the Jewish court system. He couldn't get a fair trial under the Roman court system. The Jewish court system and the Sanhedrin were in on an assassination attempt that 40 men said they're not going to eat or drink till they've killed Paul. And the Sanhedrin and chief priests were in on it. How are you going to get a good trial there? The Roman government, represented by Felix and Festus, for 2 years had let Paul just rot in Caesarea, although they knew he was not guilty, until he was forced to appeal to Rome. Now, we all know where that went, and a storm was coming on the church, as a storm no doubt will be coming in our own lives if Jesus tarries. And so Luke is recording history here. It's history with a theology. It's history with a world view. It's a history that's written with God's providence and his hand in the glove of history as this journey takes place. What a comfort it is. And our times sound a lot like their times, except worse and larger scale. Now, when we come to Acts 20, may or may not have noticed this. This trip from Caesarea to Rome, there were 3 different ships involved. Sometimes when we take trips and we have to switch planes, we'd rather just take one long shot and get it over with instead of walking through airports and doing all of that. Well, when we think we have a long trip, take a look at this one and what it involved in getting from Caesarea, which is right north of Jerusalem, to Rome. And Dr. Luke chronicled the whole thing, names, places, dates, and it was anything but smooth sailing. And Paul and company had to put up with the poor decisions of the people who were in authority over them in this storm. Now just stop and think about that. our lives, our church's life, has to be under those who are in authority, that they make decisions. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not so good, sometimes they're terrible. And we have to live with the consequences of it. That's what happened on this trip. And also on this trip, there were those who were willing to do Paul harm. And in our lives, we have the hatred against Christianity is growing very, very quickly. They would like to do us harm. And the first things we see here, and we're going to start in a moment, is the Christians received both kindness and obstinance from the Roman centurion who was over Paul. Sometimes he was very kind unexpectedly. Sometimes he was very obstinate and made bad decisions. And isn't that true in every church, in every city? People in leadership sometimes make really good decisions and they help us. And other times they make very poor decisions. You got to live with it. And so we can expect, our life voyage, and that's really what I want to emphasize here, our life voyage, that some people over us will do helpful things and some people will do hurtful things, and yet God is in it all. Over it, above it, through it, God is in it all. So sometimes we get overoccupied with secondary actors. So-and-so did me wrong. So-and-so hurt me here. If they hadn't done this, this wouldn't have happened. We get overoccupied with people. And sometimes people hurt us when they're trying to help us. And sometimes doesn't it get weird? Life full of uncontrollable things. We are not driving. We're not driving. Have you ever been in a car where somebody goes a different way than you think they should go, and you're along for the ride? They made the turn, they missed the exit, whatever, and there you are. And so this is what's going on here. So let's get going, and hopefully this will help us navigate our own journey through life. I know you know the context. Paul's a prisoner. He doesn't get a fair trial. They say you appeal to Caesar, you'll go. And we pick it up in Acts 1. When it was determined that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and certain other prisoners unto one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustus band. Now that's not a musical band. That's an army designation. He was a centurion over many Roman soldiers. His name was Julius. And we'll see that this Julius sometimes made surprisingly good decisions, and sometimes he made not so good decisions. And of course, this affected everybody. And entering into a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail by the coast of Asia, one Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. That was a Christian from the Thessalonican church. And the next day, we touched at Sidon, that's right up the coast, and Julius courteously treated Paul and gave him liberty to go to his friends to refresh himself. Now, that was a nice surprise. That seemed like a good start. The centurion is sympathetic, and he's someone who probably appreciated Paul's position and maybe was not in agreement with all the mistreatment he'd had for 2 years. So he gave him a wide benefit there when he let him, gave him liberty to go to his friends and refresh himself. Get off the boat, go to your friends, and so forth. And when we put to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus. You've got a map, you know where that is. They sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. And the lee of Cyprus is north of Cyprus. It's between Cyprus and the other, the mainland there. And so they went north of Cyprus, tried to get out of the wind, trying to not have the heavy winds hit them. And when we'd sailed over the sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. And there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy, and he put us on board. That's the first change of ships, all right? So they get off the ship that took them that far, and they get on a ship from Africa that's going to Italy, and they said, now we're boarding this ship. And he put us on board. And when we sailed slowly many days and scarcely come off Cnidus, the wind not permitting us, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmoniae. Now, Crete, of course, is an island, and passing it with difficulty, came to a place which is called Fair Havens, near to which is the city of Lasea. Now, when much time was spent, and was sailing was now dangerous because of the fast was now already past. That fast was the Day of Atonement. It was commemorated the 10th day of the 7th month. In other words, it was late. It was late to be sailing in the Mediterranean. The seas were going to be rough. And it was way past the time when people would be sailing in that ocean. Paul knew that. He was a very experienced sailor, and he knew that this was dangerous. You know, our own airlines, there's some places they don't fly. There's some places the airlines today who are 33,000 feet don't go. They don't normally go. You know where what's the highest mountain in the world? Mount Everest. They don't go there. It's too high to fly over there. Too many mountains, no place to land in an emergency. They go around it. Do you know that it's very rare for them to go some parts of the ocean? Nobody goes. There's no place to land in an emergency, so they avoid it. They'll go out of their way to have a place in case there's an emergency to land, rather than to fly over open ocean that's hundreds of miles of nothing. Once in a while you can get a flight, but it's very rare in some places. So it's very hard to get a flight from China to South America, by the way, because there's a whole lot of nothing there. So it is possible, but it's hard. And so that's kind of the way it is. And they had their own issues then. You don't fly after a certain date. After the fall, you just don't go, you put it off for a few months. And they were past the edge. So they were pushing it, and they were risking everybody's life by trying to go. But nevertheless, this ship was there, and they got on it. And so, in verse 9, now when much time was spent, apparently they had to spend longer time there than they expected. You think you've had bad layovers? Think about the layovers they had, sometimes for months. When sailing was now dangerous because of the fast was already past, Paul admonished them. He said, "Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with injury and much damage, not only of the cargo and ship, but also of our lives." We need to stop and winter here. If we don't, if we try to push through it, you're going to lose the cargo, you're going to lose the ship, and we're going to lose our lives. Now, what was that? That was the voice of experience. Paul had spent a night and day in the deep. He'd been in shipwrecks in the Mediterranean before, and he knew that this was not a wise decision. This wasn't an inspired revelation. This was the voice of Paul's personal experience. It's what he perceived. Later, Paul will get a revelation to share from God, but this is just the voice of his own experience. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. Now, that's pretty natural, right? I mean, the owner of the ship obviously ought to know something about sailing, and the master of the ship ought to know something about sailing. And so the centurion put his bet on the master and the owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. He considered them both, and he said, no, I'm going with that. Now, when he made that decision, that affected Paul. That affected everybody. Here's another one of those times in life when there are people over us. It might be in the church. It might be in the city. It might be in our state. It might be in our country, who make decisions that in their mind are good decisions, or at least viable decisions that may have some risk, but not, the kind of risk that others perceive. We're locked in. We're locked in. We might put our 2 cents in, but if it doesn't count, then we're locked in, and there we go. So Paul was a very experienced traveler, and he mentions three things are going to be lost if we do this: ship, cargo, and our lives. Not speaking by inspiration, but by experience. Now, by experience, Paul got 2 of the 3 right. By experience. Just by experience. He got two of the 3 right. The only reason he didn't get the last one right was that God intervened supernaturally and gave him everybody that was sailing with him. They didn't lose anybody's life. But he didn't know that yet. But even Paul, with his experience, got 2 right and 1 wrong. If you have 3 questions on a test and you get 2 right and 1 wrong, there's only 3, what's your grade? You're still flagging it. You just flag the test, maybe D-, depending on how gracious they are. You're not doing so good. But Paul got the D-, or the flag, by his own experience, because providence has surprises for all of us, the best of us, the most experienced of us, the most spiritual of us. God is a God of surprises, and he does things that are different than our own experience understands. Now, the pilot of the owner of the ship and the centurion, they made their decision, and with it, everybody else was affected. Now, the interesting thing is, their decision would have resulted in all 3 things happening if it wasn't for God. So God intervened. They got them all 3 wrong. Of the things Paul said, actually, they got all 3 wrong. And thank God for his intervention, his providential intervention. And that's true not just 2,000 years ago. That's true now. Do you think our government's always making the right decisions? No. Do you think we should get over nervous about it? No. Our God's still got the steering wheel. They think they've got it. They don't have it. God has it. When I was a little boy, even before I was 16, when I was small, my dad would put me on his lap in the car out in some country road and let me drive. And oh boy, I'm driving the car. Guess who I was sitting on? My dad's lap. Yeah, I'm driving the car. But he let me drive, and then he'd pull over, or if somebody was coming, he'd take the wheel, and so forth. But he was always there to correct any of my immature mistakes. We think we're driving in life. We're not driving. You're not driving. God's driving. Or we think somebody else is driving. And this other person, if they just made better decisions, my life wouldn't be so messed up. Get over that. You know, it's very important for us to understand those things. And we got an election coming up, and we think, oh, so-and-so will win. Oh, how do you know that? You think you know that? You don't know that. I'm putting all my eggs in this basket. Okay. Hope you got a lot of extra eggs. You don't know. Providence has its surprises. And so the majority vote got it wrong. The majority vote got it totally wrong. So much for democracy on this trip. They actually noted what happens here. Verse 12, because the haven was not commodious to winter in, the majority of the people in the boat advised to depart from there also, if by any means they might attain to Phoenicia and there to winter, which is a haven of Crete and lies toward the southern, southwest, and northwest. Okay, so the majority said, no, we don't want to stay here. This is too long a layover and too bad a place. Let's move on. So they voted for comfort. And so it says in verse 12, because the haven was not commodious to winter in, the greater part advised to depart from there also. But notice in verse 13, when the south wind blew softly, supposing they'd obtained their purpose, loosing from there, they sailed close by. So, when elections come by and the majority gets it wrong, don't get overly nervous. It's not the first time that's happened. God knows God's in control, not the majority. But not long after there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. And when the ship was caught, could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. And running under the lee of a certain island, which is called Cauda, we had much work to secure the boat. That's the lifeboat. Now, they did have a lifeboat, and they've got it secure, which when they'd hoisted it, they used helps undergirding the ship and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksands, that's quicksands in North Africa, struck sail and so were driven. They didn't want to get blown off course into North Africa and get into that mess. And we being exceedingly tossed with tempest, the next day we lightened the ship. The third day we cast out with our own hands the tackle of the ship, and when neither sun or stars in many days appeared, if you don't have the stars, how are you going to navigate? When the sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was taken away. Humanly speaking, they're all dead. Humanly speaking, it's turning out just like Paul said. All hope of being saved was given up, and he uses the word we. So Luke included himself there and everybody on the ship. Humanly speaking, all were going to drown. And even God's people thought that. This is it. How many times have people thought, this is it, I'm going to die, and they didn't die? Even if the doctor said they're going to die, they didn't die. Even the doctors don't know sometimes. Why? Because there's a God in heaven. He's in control. The time of our death and the manner of our death is all planned, and we're immortal till our work is done. So that's what's going on here, pretty much. And then in verse 21, God's word in a time. I'm going to make a statement, and I'm not saying this should be an example for you, but long ago I gave up eating airplane food. One of the reasons is they have better food in the airports than they used to have. So if I'm going to eat, I eat in the airport. I just skip the meal. Now, I'm not saying I always do it, but about 95% of the time. But that was a voluntary thing. But here, nobody was eating. Nobody wanted to eat. Nobody could eat. You eat when you're seasick. How can you eat when, who's going to fix the food? And in a storm like that, you're just kind of hanging on and trying to get through it. So in verse 21, but after being long without food, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, you should have hearkened to me and not have loosed from Crete and to have gained this harm and loss. Now, what was that? Was that a I told you so? Is that what it was? Well, kind of. But it wasn't just that. It wasn't just that. It was kind of that, but it wasn't just that. Paul is reminding them of his own credibility. For a reason. But then in verse 22, instead of narrating all his experience and basing everything on that, he's got something new to say, something different to say. Something this was something against his own experience. There was going to be a rescue mission from heaven. Now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar. And lo, God has given thee all them that sail with thee. That's such a precious verse. Now, all of those that were sailing with him were not saved people, but all those that sailed with him were going to be physically saved in this particular situation. And God said it before he did it. God said it before he did it, so God could be praised when he did it. So God's hand could be seen, and God's providence could be praised when it came to pass. And God makes this incredible promise, a ship that's still in a storm, that humanly speaking has no hope, that everybody's going to survive. And he said, wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God that it shall be even as it was told me. However, we must be cast upon a certain island. Now, this is God's word. This is God's word. And this word says we're all going to be saved, even though it looks like we're all going to be lost. And he says, wherefore, here's the application. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God that it shall be even as it was told me. This is our responsibility in bad times, to go with God's word rather than our own wisdom, to go with God's word rather than our own experience. Remember, Paul thought they were all going to be lost. To go with God's word rather than circumstances around us. Now, just be sure it's God's word and not just something you think God may be saying, but something he really has said. And Paul says, I believe it's going to be just as I was told. Predictive prophecy is meant to be trusted. And so I believe God that it shall be even as it was told me. However, we must be cast on a certain island. But when the 14th night was come, as we were driven up and down in Adria after midnight, the sailors deemed that they drew near to some country, and sounded and found it 20 fathoms. And when they gone a little farther, they sounded again and found it 15 fathoms. And what does that mean? The water is not as deep now. We're getting closer to land. Then fearing lest we should fall on the rocks, they cast out 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for day. And as the sailors were about to flee out of the ship, when they let down the boat into the sea under pretense as though they would have cast anchor out of the foreship, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, except these abide in the ship, you cannot be saved. God's providence does not mean we ignore the means to the end. If you don't have sailors, you got to have sailors to sail the ship into the island. And so if they got away, you just have inexperienced people. So the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off, and that meant they had to stay with the ship. And while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take food, saying, this day is the 14th day that you've tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing. I've been on a couple of cruises for 10 days. And in those cruises, you usually eat too much. My mother-in-law took us on the cruises. She paid for everything. But I was a little reticent to go on cruises because I thought, well, a lot of music and dancing and partying. That'll be the big sin on a cruise ship. No. The big sin on a cruise ship is eating too much. And try to be on one of those things and not eat too much. Well, these guys had the exact opposite. They hadn't eaten for 2 weeks. Think how weak they must have been. And Paul knew what was coming. He said, wherefore I beseech you, take some food, for this is for your health, for there shall not a hair fall from the head of any of you. You don't have to worry. Let's have our last meal on the ship. Get your strength up because we're going to have to swim for it. There's not a hair of a head on any fall out from the head of any of you. No one's going to be injured. And when he had spoken this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. He led by leadership. Who's the real leader here? It's the prisoner. Isn't that interesting? The owner and the shipmaster and the centurion got the positions, But the real leader is the one who leads through crisis and gets people through those things. You don't need position to be a leader. Paul had no position. He was lowest on the totem pole in that ship. He's a prisoner. He was under everybody. Some people think they got to have a position in the church to do it. You don't need a position. Just do ministry. You have all you can handle. And that's what Paul was doing. Then they were all good cheer, and they took some food. And we were in all the ship 276 souls. 276 souls. When they'd eaten enough, they lightened the ship, cast out the wheat into the sea. Why? This is the last meal. They're not going to have any other meals in this ship. And when it was day, they recognized not land, but they discovered a certain creek with a shore into which they were minded, if it were possible, to thrust the ship. And when they'd taken up the anchors, they committed themselves to the sea, loosed the rudder bands, hoisted the mainsail to the wind, and made for shore. I love that verse. You can almost see it happening. I mean, Luke is witnessing this, and one of those moments where this is it. You're committed. There's no turning back. You're going to ground the boat into the mouth of the creek, and falling into a place where the two seas met, ran the ship aground, and the bow stuck fast and remained unmovable, but the stern was broken with the violence of the waves. Now, apparently, they didn't get as far as they wanted to get, and now they're kind of in trouble somewhat. They're close to shore, but they're not as far on shore as they wanted to be. Well, that's an interesting. Now you got 276 people. Not all of them could swim. Where's the life jackets? No life jackets. They had no life jackets. This was before the Titanic. They had no life jackets. And yet God promised they'd all get to shore. Now, that was a rather dangerous situation for a non-swimmer. And apparently there were several non-swimmers. And the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. We got to kill these prisoners. They're going to swim, they'll swim away, then we'll have to bear their punishment. Let's just kill them all. Probably more prisoners than Paul. He was prisoner number 1. Do you remember the sailors tried to leave the ship? Now the sailors want to kill the prisoners? There's a lot of drama going on here in this little group. Sailors looking out for themselves, soldiers looking out for themselves. And in God's providence, the centurion was looking out for Paul. Thank God for when God puts you on someone's heart. Maybe even not a saved person, but a person that's taken a liking to you. And it says in verse 43, but the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that they could swim. They who could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land, and the rest, some on boards, some on broken pieces of ship. And so it came to pass that they all escaped safely to land. This was an organized thing. All the swimmers in the water. The swimmers all in the water. And so they could watch if somebody was struggling. All the non-swimmers, all right, we've got some pieces of wood here. This is your way to the island. And they all escaped safely to land. With the message from God, they acted. And what a marvelous event when it all happened the way God said it was going to happen. The ship's lost, but you all be saved. The ship is doomed. but we'll all be saved. I want to tell you something. This planet, this universe is doomed. It's all going to be destroyed. You better see what you can see when you can, because there's coming a day it's going to be gone. But thank God, we have predictive prophecy, and God has made it very clear what's going to happen. We need to be prepared for what God's going to do. We need to rejoice in what God's going to do. God told Abraham and Sarah, against all expectation, you're going to have a child, son. God had a promise. He kept his promise. God told Isaac, you're going to have two sons, but the older is going to serve the younger. God told Joseph, you're going to rule over your brothers. It all happened. God said it, and it took place. Very, very interesting how God confirms his word. In 1 Samuel 10, God tells Saul some stuff after he anoints him. This is going to happen. After this happens, you're going to go here, and then this is going to meet these people. You meet these people, and they're going to be doing this. And that's exactly what happened. And when it came true, just like God said, it confirmed to Saul that the prophecy about him being king was also going to come true. Same thing with the death of Ahab in battle, but in the prophecy by Micaiah, it was predicted. And if he comes back alive, the Lord hadn't sent me. So when God says something predictively through his prophets, it's going to happen. Embrace predictive prophecy. Embrace what God says. God said here what was going to happen before it happened, and then it happened just like he said. And believing God's prophecy doesn't mean you ignore present issues, dangers, or so forth, but it does mean you have more than human advice and human wisdom. We can be very active, not passive, in troubled times. We can have a ministry of comfort in troubled times. I believe it will be just like God said it's going to be. We're going to lose the universe. It's going to crash. But God has promised some things in his word about who will be saved and who won't. This is an incredible thing. And if you go into chapter 28, you don't have time for it. They landed on Malta and called Melita here. Paul got bit by a snake. Oh, wait, that's a poisonous snake. Paul's not going to make it. God said he was going to go to Rome. Now he's going to die. He's got to be a thief or a robber or murderer. Because no. He's an apostle, and they have special abilities. If snakes bite them, they won't die. And that's exactly what happened. Amazing stuff. I saw something when I was meditating on this. I confess I'd never put together before. And I've been studying the Bible many years, but just never saw it. But this just came to me. I'm thinking about the events of King Saul's death and the events that are put together in 1 Samuel when the Philistines are upon him. And Samuel spoke to King Saul, tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Guess what happened? Saul was killed. 4 sons were killed in battle, including Jonathan. It all happened just like God said. And Saul, because of his sin, lost everything, even his life. And he lost his sons right before his eyes. Now, Jonathan was saved. I don't know about the others, but he was. But he lost his life. Saul lost everything. It's the comparison with that event with an event that happened at the same time that actually kept David out of the battle. And remember, all his family and everybody, they got captured, and they realized the women and children are captured. So they left the battle line. They were kicked out anyway. And they They rescued every one of those people, every one of them. Wives, the children, the stuff, everything. So contrary to expectation, everything came to David that he lost. And contrary to previous provinces, Saul lost a battle and he lost everything with it. And God was in both of those. God's in charge of life and death. You and I will get where God wants us to be. You and I will be on this planet as long as he wants us here. And we need time alone with God to recognize that. Paul had time to pray and meditate and focus on God's providence, 2 years in prison. And then he had time to minister in this voyage. And he had a time to minister in Rome, but it was all God's hand. I love J. Vernon McGee's statement about providence. It's God's hand in the glove of history. And certainly we see that here in everything. And I trust that we'll be seeing it in whatever happens next to our country and to our nation and the world. The God who works on these small things, you got to control the small things to control the big things. And the God that can control the small things shows us that he's in control of everything. He's in control of everything. There's an old Western where the bad guy is over a town and he brags, I run everything. No, you don't. God. Father, thank you for what we've looked at this Sunday school hour. Challenge us with this precious, wonderful truth. A section of scripture we know, a section that is very precious. And may the God of heaven give us encouragement and strength in the storms of our lives, in the storms of our nation and our planet that are no doubt coming upon us. Work mightily in us, through us, and save souls in the midst of all of this, we pray. Amen.
Lord, as we go from this place,